Good afternoon. Okay, so two things. One, I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning to get here in Eastern time, so I'm a little tired. Secondly, I used to work in drug abuse there. If you know, they hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And if you say good morning, you know, they go, good morning. And so I've sort of become addicted to it, and I need it to help me today. So if you don't mind, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. That's the best part of the talk. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I will actually get to communicating science effectively and what we think we know about it, but I'm going to start with a little bit of context, because the need to communicate science really is in response to a rather tenuous relationship that the scientific enterprise has with the rest of society. And so let's talk about that a bit first, and I do promise you, if you think you know everything about the first part, take a nap, don't snore, but take a little bit of a nap, and I promise you we will get to communicating science effectively. So, as I implied, we're living in rather interesting times, as the euphemism goes. On the one hand, science has been making fantastic progress in virtually every domain, and I think we're all excited about that. Some of that progress is sort of incremental in nature, some of it is more transformative when major findings come about that change whole scientific paradigms and the way of thinking about things, but the progress overall has been fabulous. And what happens, on the other hand, is although the public, as you'll hear, generally likes science and scientists, they, at best, feel to be ambivalent, indifferent, or even hostile to much of science. And that creates sort of a disconnect and a substantial amount of tension. Now, the truth is, we can't do our job without the public. Of course, we need them for support, but that isn't really what it's about. In the old days, people used to talk about doing science because it's interesting and provocative. Well, the truth is, nobody cares whether it's interesting and provocative, A, and B, young scientists in particular don't do science just because it's interesting and provocative. They do it because they think they're contributing to society. And the truth is, if the public isn't a viable receptor for our work, if they're not an enthusiastic receptor, why are we doing it? And that I think is something that has evolved over time. That's a change in at least my scientific lifetime. If you acknowledged that you were doing what you were doing because you thought it might contribute to the betterment of humankind, you were, you know, a mushy person. But now, many more, particularly young scientists, understand that. And of course, we need their support. So this is my favorite quote in the entire world. I would like you to memorize it. There will be a test later. From Abraham Lincoln: public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And that's the truth. So we need a public that both understands what we do and wants to use the product of our work. So what determines how the public feels? Well, of course, it depends on the rate and form of scientific productivity, how quickly it's converted to useful products and services. And then it's tremendously important that the public views science as doing a good job, and secondly, that it's trustworthy, and I'll come a bit more to that. And then, of course, what they learned in school about science. Do you like that? So, okay, since I left NIH, I've made all my own slides, and I put a lot of work into them. So, if you don't mind, one more time. Thank you very much. All right. Well, the truth is, good, very good, okay. So the truth is that the relationship is experiencing some turbulence, and you can think of an almost infinite number of instances that go around it. So what's causing that turbulence? Well, some of it is our fault. Some of it comes about because of things going on within the scientific enterprise, and it's essential that we be seen as keeping our own house in order. And that has been a bit of a struggle, to be clear. So these are just a listing, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but an array of issues within science aren't going so well. Whenever you say something like this, people say, oh, that's just a rare event. That almost never happens, right? So I was at the National Institutes of Health when 5 instances of conflict of interest got exposed. They happened to be in my institute. 5 instances, and it almost brought NIH down. 28,000 people, thousands of scientists, 5 instances, and it almost brought it down. And you see that all the time. Instances of violations of animal welfare, scientific misconduct, and now the issue of the day is non-reproducible findings. Whether findings can be reproduced. To be candid, from my perspective, and I'd be happy to argue this later, I think that's exaggerated. But it's an issue and a public one, and it undermines public trust. There also are a bunch of issues around the intersection of science and the rest of society. They're more external to the scientific community, sort of, and they indirectly influence the climate. So overall, and I do this part because people always say, but the public likes science. And the truth is, yes, they do. They like science and they respect scientists. And I'm really sorry that you can't see this, but I can make up whatever I want. I don't know, does this thing work? No. Okay, so blue is people like us, and yellow is not so much. So you can see that overall, people have a generally favorable view of science as an enterprise. And in fact, this is a study that's been done since the early 1970s, and I love it. It was comparative initially, looking at what professions are most respected by the American public. And you can see trends over time where, I'm looking at this thing sort of pointing at it, which you can't see. But purple, right, the military are now the most respected, and scientists actually have come next. I do want to point out, and made sure these were on this slide, the press and the Congress aren't doing so well. But there's no question that people respect and have a great deal of confidence in the leaders of science. And here the purple line says, people see the benefits of science outweighing the risks. I'm sorry for so many detailed looking slides. The people in the front can see it. Those of you who wanted to nap and multitask are sitting in the back. You can't see it, so it's your loss. All right. And then, yeah, I'm going to skip that. The message is overall they like us. They do. You got it? But what about trust? Do they trust us? Well, overall, when people have been asked, do you trust research scientists to tell the truth? A lot, yes. Right? See the arrow? Report their findings accurately? Yes. Report their findings even if they go against the sponsor of the research? Less. But still, the majority of the public believe that, and that's one way or a set of ways to look at it. Overall, people trust science and scientists, but not everybody. Not only not every scientist, but not everybody in the public. I'm sorry, again, hard to read, but the top line is liberals. Liberals, have a lot of trust in science, and less so among conservatives and moderates. And you can see that in the case of conservatives, the little squares, that's actually gone down over time. So although overall the public trusts science, it's gone down over time, and it's gone down in a very important part of the American population. This is the best article ever written on trust in science. It's written in the New Yorker, of all things, by Atul Gawande, published, in case you want to get it, June 10th, 2016. And if you're interested in the topic, I'm not kidding, it is a fabulous analysis of the issue. Okay. Then you get to specific issues. Is this boring? I like to get a titration every once in a while and sort of see how it's going. All right. So when you get to specific issues, particularly controversial ones, the situation gets more complicated. And we have a lot of science-related issues that are controversial. So the controversy comes about between what science is showing and either political or economic convenience. That's the situation with climate change, right? There's not a deep moral thing about climate change. The thing about climate change is if you believe in it, it's a big pain in the neck to do something about it, and it's very expensive. Also, controversy comes about, actually most powerfully, when scientific findings conflict with people's peer group beliefs. So what you find is that very frequently people feel a certain way about what science is showing based on what their friends and neighbors feel, more so than some other thing. And then there's a whole category of things that actually I've done a lot of work around, which is when science conflicts with people's core values or their norms or their religious beliefs, you get into a tremendous amount of tension. And just some issues to show you where the tension comes about in conflict against values. So embryonic stem cell research. Studies have been done about why does the public object to embryonic stem cell research. Well, the truth is it has nothing to do with the public's belief about whether embryonic stem cell research is good for you. That is, they know that it will lead to better diagnostics, better treatments, whatever. But it conflicts with their view about when life begins. If you believe life begins at the moment of conception, well, then you're against embryonic stem cell research. You're taking a life. But many religions believe that life begins later in gestation or at the moment of birth. And therefore, it isn't a problem. So I threw in synthetic biology and neuroscience because people always say I'm paranoid about this set of issues. So think about synthetic biology. If you say you can make a nose in a petri dish, or you can make ears, people go, oh, isn't that cool? How about you can make an Alan, or you can make a person they don't like so much, me they like, but, right? People are quite uncomfortable. So in neuroscience, we have more and more in our field come to recognize that we have an array of issues that intersect with society. Society's not so excited about the fact that we think you don't have a separate mind and body. You don't have a mind floating around somewhere out there. In fact, think about it. Where's your soul? Right? Not so cool. And there are a whole series of ethical issues that come about. And then scientists and the public think quite differently about some issues. I don't know, can you see this at all? Oh, good, especially the people who had the sense to sit up front. Okay, so just some examples. This is from a fabulous Pew survey. And so what you're seeing is a gap between what scientists believe on the right and the American adults on the left. So safe to eat genetically modified foods. 88% of scientists say generally safe. The public, 37%. Go down, humans evolved over time. 98% of scientists, that's good. 65% of the population. Vaccinations, 86% of scientists thinks that children should be vaccinated, but only 68. You get, and the message from that is an important one. Oh, this is Atul Gawande. I like this. Yeah, it's evident. I hope you can read it. To defend those long-held beliefs, public dismisses the authority of science, of the scientific community, and they claim they have a truer scientific authority. But I just made that up recently, you know. Just a quick anecdote. I'm watching the time, don't worry. So my brother-in-law was an organic farmer, but he had a PhD in anthropology. And one day we're standing in our foyer and we're talking, and he's giving me a lecture about food. I happen to have a PhD that was half in nutritional biochemistry, so I felt like I knew a little bit. And he's giving me this lecture, and I said, well, you know, the data show, blah, blah, you know, the opposite, to which he replied, well, there are data, and there are data. And I thought to myself, get out of the room. And I did, and we remain very good friends. But the truth is, and this actually is very important, only we are stuck with what science shows. The public is not. So if I misuse scientific evidence, or if I distort it, or I ignore it, I'll be struck by lightning, right? I mean, I'll have no credibility. I won't be able to do my job. But the public doesn't get struck, right? They say climate change isn't true. Where's the lightning? And that's very important. It actually sounds funny, but it isn't. They're quite free to play with scientific evidence, but we're not. And this is just a quote from a judge that I was in the room. The GI system wins out over the nervous system. There are a couple of us neuroscientists here who I've known a long time. They can resonate to this. All right, so this is a report that just came out from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and if you want to be depressed but are interested in the question of public views of science, this is like the best thing I've ever seen. So the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is free on the website called Perception of Science in America. Okay, so the critical question is, what do you do about it? Now, you have two choices. One, you can whine, and every time somebody violates the integrity of science, you can go, don't do that. And actually, I am the official whiner. It's my job to do that whenever it happens. Or you can think about what do you do? And so the temptation for the scientific community is always to say, well, they just don't get it. We're going to educate them. The truth is, often they do get it. They don't like it. And if they don't like it, they're not stuck with it. So what do you do? Well, oh, I just said that. Don't look at that. So then you have choices. I'm sorry, I'm hung up on Atul Gawande. I just reread the article before I put this talk together. You can assert true facts and bore people to death with a narrative. You can expose bad science, or you can engage with the public, and that's what we actually advocate. And scientists have to engage with everybody in the public, not only the people they want to support them, but their policymakers or others. No. And everybody agrees. That's what those green circles say. Okay, now, public engagement is a different strategy from education. Education is communication at somebody. Public engagement is communication with somebody. You move the strategy from a monologue to a dialogue, and this has been studied extensively, and I promise you, the engagement approach, which actually is much more popular in Europe than it is here, has been much more effective in dealing with some of these very tough issues. But it requires that scientists listen, and that's not our prime skill. And in fact, effective science engagement or communication is a learned skill. Most scientists, untrained, should not be allowed out in public. They're arrogant, they say terrible things, and they bore people to death. Hopefully I am not boring you at the moment. It also has been studied scientifically, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. So I had the pleasure to chair a study for the National Academy of Sciences recently that ended up with this report called Communicating Science Effectively. And I'm going to tell you what the report says because it articulates what we know. And I warn you in advance, a lot of it feels to me when I say it to be self-evident. But the truth is, if it's so self-evident, why don't we do it? Okay, so when you're sitting there going, my grandmother knew that, think about my grandmother knew it, how come I don't do it? So here we go. What has it shown? First of all, this is just to tell you what the committee was asked to do. What do we know about effective science communication? What do we not know? And what additional research needs to be done? There is by now an entire research community who focus on what works and what doesn't work. And I'm going to go through rapidly some of the what works. So these are some of the cross-cutting themes. So it's hard. It's hard because scientific information is complex and it's uncertain, and people hate uncertainty. They can't get it. They don't know what we're talking about. You're uncertain, that means you don't know what you're talking about. This isn't, 97% of scientists believe the Earth is warming and it's caused by anthropogenic factors, humans, okay? Aha, what about the 3%? What if they're right? People process information in different ways, and I alluded before to the influence of social communities, and they're tremendously important and tremendously influential. This is my favorite, and if there's one single point that you'll take away, take this one. So it's called the deficit model, and it's wrong. The model is if we just do a better job communicating science to the public, educating them, they'll like us better and they'll do it better, right? Wrong. It doesn't work, and it's been studied again numerous times. And I put this little caveat at the bottom because Lord Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal of the UK, once I was giving a talk and he was in the audience, he came up to me afterwards and he said, "Alan, you are wrong. You do need a minimum understanding. It's a little hard to argue gravity waves if you don't know anything about it. But the truth is, overall, the deficit model is wrong. And people don't make decisions based only on science. They bring in their own goals, their own knowledge, their values, their beliefs, and we need to pay attention to that. We can't just say, we'll run over you. I'm smart, do it my way. Here is what the data show. People aren't going to do it. You have to know what you're trying to accomplish. This is the epitome of self-evident, right? How would we do anything if we don't know what we want to get done? But the strategy you use is vastly different in each of those cases, and it pays to know what you're trying to get done and plan it out in advance. The media environment is terrible for communication. It's fragmented. There are no filters. There are no gatekeepers. Nobody is sitting there saying, you know, you tweeted that and it's wrong. People say that, but nobody pays any attention. And there are, of course, many voices competing. Am I going too fast? Nah, these are easy. All right, this is something that's now a jargon talk, but mental models, that is, no matter what people hear, they bring and put it into the context of their own beliefs about the world. You need to know what they are. You need to respond to the metaphors they'll create, not the ones you'll create. And that third bullet actually surprised me a little bit, but it's the audience is typically listening not only to what you say, but they're trying to figure out why are you saying it. What's your motivation? What's the value system that underpins what you hear? I said that before. People dislike uncertainty. This is a much more polite way to say it, but the truth is they hate it. There's another jargon term called framing. Framing is how you cast an issue, and that should be obvious, is tremendously important, but we talk to people the way we want to talk about it. We don't talk to them in a way that makes it particularly meaningful. And this is actually the one thing you'll take out, is a new word for you. Glocal. How many people know that word? 3. Good. What a bright group. The first time I heard it was from the then director of the Mexico City Science Museum, who was giving a talk, and she said Glocal, and I thought it was her accent. But in fact, it's a concept that people only care about things that are locally or personally meaningful. They actually don't care about other things, and therefore what you need to do is find a way to make gravity waves personally meaningful to people. Now, somehow people are really excited about gravity waves. How many people in this room understand gravity waves? If you do, you should get a Nobel Prize, because the physicists, when I've asked them, they don't really know what they are, but they know the disturbance in the measurements that they make. But the point is important, that you need to make things personally meaningful. Engagement in a formal way is very effective. It's much better than sort of loosey-goosey conversations. Science over the backyard fence, unless you take all these other things into account, can be detrimental. And my favorite is that there's one thing not on this list, and that's the big town meeting that scientists love to hold, where some really smart person gets up and gives a lecture for the public. It has no effect. But it's a lot of fun if you're the speaker, because you like big crowds. So when I was running the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I had 14 town meetings around the country in order to spread the word about addiction being a health issue. And the truth is, all that happened was that the extremes on both sides grabbed the microphones and yelled at each other. And I don't think we moved people a lot. But real engagement, and there's a list, real engagement does seem to work, and people find common ground in amazing ways. During the arguments about whether to teach evolution in the schools, I was spending about 60% of my time on that issue. And what we found was that we could find common ground with, right-wing evangelicals or the, extreme atheists on the other side. You're not going to move them, so don't talk to them. But if you go towards the rational middle, you would be amazed at the common ground if you listen, if you hear the other perspective and you try to find the places where, in fact, you can have shared understanding. You may not get to unanimity. Oh, I just said that. Okay, these are just some cute things I like. Don't harangue the public like I'm haranguing you. Don't do it. It doesn't work. I like this. So Jerry Fink is a virologist at MIT, and he one day said to me, "Don't breathe ether on the audience." And I sort of like that. Stories. So the most effective way of impressing people is by telling stories. And I happen personally to love stories, but yesterday, one of my things in retirement is advocating for more support for agriculture research in the United States. And a group called the Supporters of Agriculture Research had a briefing on Capitol Hill that I spoke at yesterday, and And what they were releasing was a series of stories about what basic agriculture science has done for you lately. And they are fabulous, and people loved it. And so when we talk to the public about what life as a scientist, the good parts, what life as a science is about, or the excitement of what you've discovered, the people who are the best at this, by the way, is NASA. Think about all that astronomy stuff that gets so much money and costs a really big fortune. I mean, the secret truth is we're not so sure what it does for you, but people love it. And the way that it's portrayed is something that seems to be very attractive. One of my other favorite sayings, hyperbole is the enemy of credibility. I think that's self-evident. Credibility is conferred by the audience, not by the speaker. That one's a little tough for scientists. And then people are lumpers. I made that word up. They only hear sound bites. We love nuances. So I'm the guy who brought you addiction as a brain disease. When I first started talking about it that way, the addiction community wanted me to die. Because, there's all this stuff about the morality of drug use and all that stuff. And so they said, well, you got to be more precise so that people understand it. And the behavioral scientists wanted me to add their part, and the social scientists. So every time I said addiction is a brain disease, comma, expressed in behavioral ways and in a social context, nobody has ever heard anything but addiction is a brain disease. And that's a lesson in life that happens to be working out pretty well right now because people are starting to see addiction as a health issue. But there is no caveats. You don't get caveats and clauses. All you get is the soundbite. So, okay, I've quickly run through, and I apologize for talking so fast and using too many slides as a communication talk. But the truth is that we are learning more and more. There's a scientific enterprise that does it, and at some point we're going to have to use the science to replace intuition, ideology, common sense about how to communicate. Because we think we're really good at it, because we're good teachers in the classroom, or we're interesting teachers in the classroom. It ain't enough. And there are lots of training programs now being offered. Many universities are bringing science communication into their curricula, not only communicating among scientists, but how do you communicate to the public? I'll tell you, when I first got to Science magazine, started writing the editorials in Science, I'm a fabulous writer, just ask me. And the first editing I got back, actually the second time I did it, the editor wrote on it, "You have a point, right?" I thought that was a little demeaning. I cut her salary substantially. No, but publishing in Science magazine is like writing a grant proposal, right? You put the wowie, the zowie up in the front, and then you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. But if you don't get somebody's attention in the first paragraph, it's over. And same is true. But anyway, let's use the science and have it replace common sense, intuition, etc., and do it more. Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the clock. It says okay. Questions?
Oh yeah, we'll have questions.
Okay.
And I will help with that. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Leshner. That was very, very stimulating. I'd like to start by asking you a question, and we'll open it up to the audience. I've just been reading the War on Science. It's a fairly recent book that was published, And the author points out that only about 2% of the members of Congress have any background or training in science, and the rest of them are in social sciences, humanities, law, and most of them actually avoided science at all costs.
Most of the public.
So that creates a real challenge for us because we don't have enough scientists, we don't have enough people that are leading our country that have a basis in science. Any recommendations for how we work with Congress?
Yeah. Go to local congressional offices. You know these big trips everybody takes to Washington and, you know, the day on the Hill? Come on, they have people coming in, 10 people a day asking, you know, hello, how are you, give me money. And no, go see them in their local offices, invite them to your labs. This is a very exciting place. It really is. You all are doing fabulous things that normal people will really like. Invite them here. And that's much more effective than going and they get lobbied constantly. That's my advice. And they're smart. Don't underestimate them. Just because they don't agree with you doesn't mean they're dumb. It means they disagree with you. And that nuance is very important, and they will know if you think they're dumb.
Great. We have a question.
So to follow up, actually, so it looks like there are now a number of scientists who are going to be running for, Congress and in the coming elections. So what would be your recommendations for these scientists who are running, for Congress?
So they need, everybody hear the question, what would we recommend to scientists running for the Congress? First of all, pay attention to the public. Just because you're smart doesn't mean they'll elect you. And we have over time, as Dean Robinson said, we have had some scientists in Congress. In fact, my successor as the CEO of AAAS is a former member of Congress, Rush Holt. But they need to communicate with the public as the public. They need to find what the public is interested in. And they have to act like politicians, not like scientists. And that's very difficult for scientists. However, there have been some examples over time in both parties who have been tremendously successful at it. We need scientists in the Congress. It's a very big issue. People don't understand science, but we have to find a way to let them use science in their own terms. Let me give you a quick example of that I love. So back in around the year 2000, we were introducing a new medication for heroin addiction called buprenorphine. And it was really tough because it's a partial agonist, which means it can be addicting, and we had methadone, and we wanted it in doctors' offices, and there was a lot of objection to it. And one day, Senator Levin from Michigan called me down to his office and said, I've heard about this medication called buprenorphine, and and I think I get it. It's a heroin blocker, and therefore it would be good. And I said, being my good scientist, well, it's not actually a heroin blocker. Don't say that. It's a partial agonist, and it really, and all this stuff. And he listened carefully, and he said, oh, thank you. And then he went on the floor of the Senate the next day, and he said, we need to vote to get buprenorphine into doctors' offices. It's a very effective heroin blocker. And you know what? It passed by voice vote, and there are 2 million patients on buprenorphine today, prescribed from their doctors' offices. So I love that story.
Got a question? Dr. Campbell.
I was wondering what's your view on open access paper publication and how that is affecting communicating science amongst the scientific community itself?
Okay, so open access is about communication among scientists. It is not about communicating to the public, because the public ain't reading pituitary adrenocortical function, I promise you. It crushes me, by the way, because that's what I studied. But so there's open access and there's open access. And actually, one of my committees that I chair is worrying this at the moment. So open access basically means if the author pays, then anybody can get access to the paper for free. It's a lousy business model, and therefore we at Science Magazine never did it, but we do have, they have, an open access journal that we started called Science Advances, which is making money. There's good open access, and there are lots of good open access journals, like some of the PLOS journals, and every publisher has an open access one. But then there are these awful open access journals that are publishing mills and will publish anything that somebody pays. And it's really they're called predatory journals by people like me, because they're really preying on the scientific community, and they think they'll get promoted. Now, the problem in all of this, of course, is the incentive system in academia that reinforces the number of papers, not necessarily the quality of papers. And so many of us are trying to do something to get rid of the predatory journals, but they are out there and they're terrible. But open access per se is not good or bad. I mean, everybody wants there to be free access. It's just somebody's got to pay for it. It costs 50.
Sorry, do you think there's a way to get rid of these predatory journals though? Because I know that Niels list will at one point allow scientists to see exactly which ones are the predatory journals, but then there were lawsuits against that, and so it has disappeared. And how do you do that?
So predatory, the definition of a predatory journal is in the eyes of the beholder, not in the eyes of some master list. I have no idea what to do about it. We can yell at them. We can exhort the scientific community to demand peer review and quality peer review. And there are, publishers who are trying to do open access with, but I have to tell you, if Science Magazine were to go open access, published papers, the author would have to pay between $25,000 and $30,000 an article to publish it. I got yelled at when I said $10,000 back in the early 2000s, and then Nature says it would cost 25,000 pounds. That's more than my number. But it's incredibly expensive to publish, and people don't realize that Science Magazine costs $50 million a year to do. And so somebody's got to pay for it. And any business model somebody can come up with, I'm sure Rush Holt would be delighted to hear it.
Other questions? President Wilson.
Thank you, Dr. Leshner. This is remarkable, and do let us know when you're going to be the guest host on the Tonight Show. Very, very well. If I could just ask you to elaborate on a comment you made earlier about younger people having a gratitude about science. And if you could just say more in a general sense or more specific sense of the evolution across the generations in your career in terms of the relationship with science and how it might affect communication and education for that.
So a quick anecdote. So I'm about finished chairing a big study for the National Academy of Sciences on graduate education in science and restructuring it. And one of the things we're going to recommend is what we're calling core competencies that are the minimum everybody has to develop. So everybody agreed easily about communicating among scientists. Every graduate student has to know how to do that. And then the younger members of the committee said, wait a minute, what about communicating to the public as a core competency? You know, talking to normal people? I, alone, it turned out, on the committee, said that's unreasonable. I was outvoted unanimously by the committee, and there is a widespread belief that every scientist, and it's quite widespread, I've learned, quite widespread, led by younger scientists who want people to know what they do. They want people to benefit from it, and that's a change. When I started out, and you know, I studied hormones and behavior, you can imagine. I was in the newspaper all the time, and I don't know why. And I got a lot of grief about it from my colleagues who said, you know, you're wasting your time, and you're, you know, what are you doing, pandering, and you just like the stage, which is true, I do, but, and that's changed. That really has changed. With this program AAAS has to train scientists, thousands of scientists have come to get that kind of training, and 70% are what we would call young scientists. So there is an evolution, and I welcome it. I think it's really wonderful.
I shared something with Dr. Leshner just a little earlier today. And this is out of what else but this journal Science. And it says that the Department of India's Department of Science and Technology plans to require PhD scholars to write a popular science article on their research before they qualify for their PhD. Do you think that's something we need to do here?
Yep. I really think all you have to, so when I was coming up, as they say, as a scientist, physicists all thought they were the smartest people on earth. Some of you are physicists, I apologize for this, sort of. And they would say, and I would say, because I'm sort of a science junkie, right? And I would say, so tell me about what you do. How you wouldn't understand it. You know, it's so esoteric, it's so advanced. If, as my mother would say, if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. So she was a tough cookie.
Hi, Dr. Leshner. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and living here at university. I have a question about social media. Do you think that companies like Facebook should be held responsible for the scientific and unscientific things that go viral?
I don't know how you would do that. I have no idea. To be honest, it's a waste of time. What would you do? Have a law that says you can't violate the data? The lightning? Do you want to hear a quick story about that? I am watching the clock, don't worry. So I have a friend who's a PhD physicist, and one day we're having dinner, and he said, climate change? I don't believe it. You know, I spent a lot of my life trying to convince folks, he pushed the button, the speech, 10,000 studies, converging evidence. At the end of it, he said, I just don't believe it. And you know what? He didn't get struck by lightning.
I just want to recognize we do have an audience of 11, so if there are, yes, do you have a question? No question? One more. Okay, yes.
I'll first limit if they do have questions first.
They don't.
They don't? Okay. So first of all, with regards to Dr. Campbell's question from earlier, I'm Kelly, I'm a librarian, and the librarians can help if you are looking at places to publish and wondering if an open access journal might be predatory or not. And Beale's list, or part of it, has since become a database called Compels. So if you would like the library to purchase that, please let us know so that we could get that, we could potentially get that in the next budget cycle. My question for Dr. Leshner is, what do you think there may be ways to involve not just the scientific community, but also people arts and humanities in helping communicate science? Could there be potential partnerships between those disciplines to really help maximize the benefits and kind of bring?
So 10 years ago, I might have said no. However, Alan Alda runs one of the best, it's a little long, but one of the best training programs around for communicating science. And he trains people using improvisation. I've taken it, and it's a lot of fun. I don't know how much I learned, but that's one. Secondly, the National Academy of Sciences just, I think it's out, put a study chaired by David Skorton, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, on art and science. And it's asking exactly that question. Can art and the humanities help science tell its story? I can't remember the conclusion, but I think it was yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to thank every one of you for attending, and I'd like to special thank
Thank you. Thank you.